Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something spooky?
Oh, I love spooky.
I thought you might. This time, we're headed to Loon Lake, Minnesota.
Okay, I've heard of Loon Lake. It's beautiful, right?
Oh yeah, it's totally picturesque, but it also has this, well, dark side.
Uh-oh. What kind of dark side?
A local legend that's been around for ages, and not just like a campfire story. This one's really stuck around.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the legend about?
Well, we're basing this deep dive on an article that really gets into it. The Witch of Loon Lake, Unraveling a Haunting Legend.
Sounds promising.
So get ready because we're going to try and sort out the facts from, well, the spooky folklore.
I'm ready to get spooked. And I'm really interested in how legends like this get woven into the history of a place.
Me too.
Mm.
Let's start with the basics. The legend centers on this woman living near Loon Lake back in the late 1800s.
Okay, so pretty far back, what was going on?
She was kind of a recluse, lived alone in a cabin in the woods outside the small town of Vergas.
A cabin in the woods. That sounds pretty peaceful, honestly.
It does, right? But back then, that kind of life made her an outsider.
I can see how that might be, especially back then if you weren't part of the community.
Exactly. And she relied on herbs and traditional remedies for healing. So kind of a folk healer vibe, you know?
So she was probably pretty knowledgeable about plants and all that, but back then...
Yeah, it wasn't exactly seen as a good thing, especially in a small town where people are already suspicious of anyone different.
That makes sense. So what happened to her? Why a witch?
Well, that's where things take a dark turn. Whispers started, and pretty soon they turned into accusations of witchcraft.
Wow, witchcraft. That's a serious accusation.
It was. The article suggests the townspeople were going through some tough times, maybe bad harvests, who knows, and they needed someone to blame.
Oh, so it's the classic scapegoat situation. Things go wrong, people get scared, and they look for someone to point the finger at?
It happens all the time throughout history, doesn't it? And sadly, it was no different here. People stormed her cabin and...
Don't leave me hanging.
Well, this is where the legend splits into two versions. Some say she was burned at the stake, right there by the lake. Others say they drowned her in the lake itself.
Oh, wow. Both versions are pretty brutal. It's interesting that both have stuck around, though.
I know, right? It adds to the mystery, for sure. And it makes the idea of a vengeful spirit even more potent.
Oh, so that's where the haunting comes in.
Exactly. To this day, people say her spirit still haunts Loon Lake. And it's not just campfire stories either. People claim to have seen some pretty spooky stuff.
Okay, you're going to have to tell me more about that.
Oh, we'll get to the spooky encounters, don't worry. And we'll dive into whether there's any truth to this witch being a real person or just a product of people's fears.
This is getting good. Let's hear about those spooky encounters. Spooky encounters. I'm all ears.
All right, so picture this. You're out on Loon Lake at night, maybe fishing or just enjoying the peace and quiet. And suddenly, you see these orbs of light just hovering over the water.
Okay, that's a little creepy. Just floating there.
Yeah, like little balls of light. Some people believe it's the witch, trying to lure people to the same watery grave she met.
Ooh, trying to draw them in. That's scary. But, I have heard that swamp gas can sometimes create those kinds of lights.
Right. It's like,
Well,
is it supernatural or is it just like some swampy science experiment happening?
exactly. That's what makes these stories so fun to unpack. Is it the witch or is it some gassy microbes having a party?
Who knows, right? But either way, I'd probably be freaked out if I saw those lights out there. And it's not just visual stuff either. There are also stories about people hearing things.
Oh, like voices.
Yeah, whispers and cries, sometimes even screams coming from the woods. And the article mentions that a lot of these reports come from people camping or hiking near where her cabin supposedly stood.
That's so interesting how the spirit is often linked to a specific location, isn't it? It really grounds the legend in a real place. It's not just some abstract haunting. It's tied to that spot.
It definitely adds to the creepiness. So we've got mysterious lights, we've got disembodied voices, but it gets even spookier. There have been actual sightings.
Sightings of the witch, like people have seen her.
Yep. Witnesses describe seeing a shadowy figure, a woman in a long dress, usually near the lake. Oh, and get this. They often mention seeing her glowing eyes.
Glowing eyes, that is terrifying. I feel like that's a common theme in so many ghost stories, isn't it? Glowing eyes.
Totally. It's such a chilling detail. It makes you
Okay.
wonder, if this is all just made up, why are these specific things so consistent in the stories?
Yeah, why glowing eyes? You'd think people would come up with different details if they were just making things up. I wonder if it's something primal, about fear of the unknown, like something watching you from the darkness.
Maybe. It's like our brains are hardwired to be creeped out by glowing eyes in the dark. So we've got the lights, the voices, the sightings, but it doesn't stop there. There's also the idea of a curse associated with the Witch of Loon Lake.
A curse. Ooh, now we're getting serious. That adds a whole new level to things. What kind of curse are we talking about?
Well, the article describes it as a warning, almost. Like, if you mess with the place where the witch dyed the lake, the shoreline, even where her cabin stood, bad things will happen to you.
So it's not just a spooky presence. It's like there's an active force that punishes people.
That's the idea, yeah. And we're not talking about a little bit of bad luck here. The stories describe people vanishing, getting into terrible accidents, even suddenly falling ill, all because they disturbed something related to the witch.
Wow, that's intense. Do you think it's playing into those primal fears we were just talking about, like with the glowing eyes? Maybe this idea of a curse is tapping into some deep-seated fear of consequences, like a fear of upsetting a powerful force.
Ooh, I like that. It's like we all have this sense that our actions have consequences, right?
Mm.
And maybe the curse is a way of amplifying that, making it supernatural.
Yeah, it's like don't mess with things you don't understand, or there will be a price to pay. But are there specific examples of this curse in action? Like what kind of bad things happened?
Oh, the article mentioned some pretty creepy examples. There's a story about these fishermen, experienced guys who knew the lake well, and they just vanished. Their boat was found capsized, but no sign of them. And then there's the story about a hunter who got totally lost in the woods, even though he knew the area like the back of his hand.
So it's like people getting disoriented, losing their way. That is scary. And these are people who should have known better.
Right. It wasn't like they were just clueless tourists wandering around. And there are even stories of people, like, mocking the legend and then suddenly getting sick.
Oh, so it's like disrespecting the legend brings bad luck. I've heard of that happening in other places with local legends or superstitions. It makes you wonder, is it really a curse or is it more about how our minds work?
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. If you go into the woods believing there's a curse, you're probably going to be more on edge, right? You'll be more likely to jump at shadows, maybe even make mistakes because you're so worried about the curse.
Yeah, you might be more likely to trip and fall if you're constantly looking over your shoulder afraid of the witch's curse. So maybe it's not an actual curse, but more like...
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You believe something bad will happen, so you act in a way that makes it more likely.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like when you watch a scary movie, and suddenly every little noise in your house freaks you out.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the spooky side of Loon Lake, but there's also the historical context.
Yes, let's dig into that. The late 1800s in rural Minnesota, that was a very different time. What did the article have to say about how that might have influenced the legend?
Well, from what I read, life back then was tough. The winters were brutal, harvests could be unpredictable, and people were really dependent on nature for survival.
Right, so much less technology and modern conveniences. People were a lot more vulnerable to the forces of nature, and that must have created a lot of anxiety.
Absolutely. And in that kind of environment where people are already struggling, it's easy to see how superstitions and fears of the unknown would take hold.
It's like when things are tough and you don't have a clear explanation for why things are going wrong, you start looking for answers. And sometimes those answers end up being
Supernatural. Blaming a witch for your misfortunes.
Exactly. And the article suggests that the woman who became known as the witch, well, she might have just been a convenient scapegoat. Remember, she lived alone, used herbal medicine, and kept to herself.
So she was different. And in a small, isolated community, that can make you a target.
Absolutely. It's a sad pattern we see throughout history, especially with women who were healers, midwives, or who just lived outside the norms of society.
It's like people feared what they didn't understand,
Mm-hmm.
and they turned that fear into accusations of witchcraft.
And those accusations could have devastating consequences, as we see in the legend. But, the article mentions something interesting. While historical records are scarce, there are hints that a woman matching the witch's description might have actually lived in the area.
Really? So maybe there's a grain of truth to this story.
It's possible, and that adds another layer to the whole thing. On one hand, you have these spooky encounters and the curse, but on the other hand, you have this potential real woman who might have been ostracized and maybe even harmed simply because she was different.
Wow, that makes the whole legend so much more complex, doesn't it? It's like we're not just talking about a spooky story anymore. We're talking about a real person's life, their struggles, and how those struggles might have been twisted into this terrifying legend.
It really makes you think. And it reminds us us that behind every legend, there are often real human stories waiting to be uncovered. Stories that can teach us a lot about the past, about human nature, and about how we deal with fear and uncertainty.
Well said. And speaking of uncovering stories, the article also talks about how the legend of the Witch of Loon Lake is still very much alive today. In fact, it's become a big part of the area's identity, attracting tourists and inspiring all sorts of creative works.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's like the legend has taken on a life of its own, separate from the historical reality, whatever that may be. I'm curious, what are some of the ways the town of Vergas has embraced the legend?
Yeah, it's like it's become part of their local culture.
It has. The article mentions, for example, they have these guided ghost tours.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so you can go out on the lake at night and they tell you all the spooky stories. They even point out the locations where people claim to have seen the witch or heard her or, experienced the curse.
I bet those tours are popular.
Super popular. And there are even a few businesses that have kind of built their whole thing around the witch. Like, there's this cafe called the Broomstick Brew. Can you believe that?
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I love it when towns embrace their spooky side like that. But, not everyone's convinced about all the supernatural stuff, right?
Oh, definitely not. The article mentions there are plenty of skeptics, and they raise some good points, too.
Like what?
Well, remember those mysterious lights over the water? The ones that some people think are the witch trying to lure people in?
Yeah, those creepy orbs.
Well, skeptics say it could just be swamp gas. Apparently, when organic matter decomposes in marshy areas, it can release these gases that create flickering lights.
Huh. So instead of a spooky witch, it could just be, like, decomposing plants. That's kind of a letdown.
I know, right? Takes a bit of the mystery out of it. And those disembodied voices that people claim to hear in the woods, skeptics say those could be anything from the wind rustling through the trees to, animals making noises.
That makes sense. Our brains can play tricks on us, especially when we're already a little freaked out. Like we're primed to hear spooky whispers when we're in a place with a reputation for being haunted.
Absolutely. Our expectations can really influence our perceptions. But, even with all the skeptical explanations, the legend still persists.
It does, doesn't it? There's still something about Loon Lake that makes people feel uneasy.
I think that speaks to the power of these stories. We're drawn to the mystery, to the idea that there might be things out there we don't fully understand. Even if we can explain some of the phenomena, there's always that lingering question, what if?
Exactly. And that's what makes legends like this so fascinating. They make us think, they spark our curiosity, and they remind us that there's still a lot about the world that we don't know.
So true. And, no matter what you believe, the story of the Witch of Loon Lake has clearly had a lasting impact on the area. It's become a part of their history, their culture, their tourism.
And it's a reminder that these stories, even if they're based on fear and superstition, can teach us a lot about the past, about human nature, and about how we make sense of the world around us.
So what do you think? Are you convinced by the spooky stuff? Do you think there's really a witch haunting Loon Lake?
Honestly, I'm not sure. But I definitely think it's a place worth visiting if you ever get the chance. Maybe you'll have a spooky encounter of your own.
Or maybe you'll just enjoy the beauty of the lake and the charming town of Vergas. Either way, it sounds like a fascinating place to explore.
Definitely. And that wraps up our deep dive into the Witch of Loon Lake. We hope you enjoyed it.
And we hope it made you think a little bit about the power of stories, the things we believe, and the mysteries that still linger in our world. Until next time, happy exploring.
And keep an open mind.